So you are the judge of the code and you also love chess a lot. So can you tell us if there is any connection being the judge as well as the chess player?
Uh, well, as the judge of the court, you have to keep making decisions, and you always have to be aware of the consequences of your decisions. And that is a lot like chess. In chess, you make decisions, and you have to be aware that there are consequences, and those consequences can be positive or negative, depending on the decision that you make. So there are parallels between chess and life, and there are parallels between chess and justice. Chess is always fair, and I try.
Going to be looking at two games from my countryman and my teammate Brian Cottle here. And these two games are going to feature fantastic end games. One of these end games will be a proof or a practical example, basically, of the good knight, bad bishop position. And the second game is going to be basically bishops of the same color, but we are going to see an interesting end game and how Brian managed to maneuver those end games and earn a win for St. Vincent. So without much ado, let's jump right into this game. Brian's opponent here, Peter Rowe. By the way, I think Brian's opponent is actually like 71 years old. I hope I have the correct person. I tried to research a little bit on his opponent, Peter Rowe here, and I saw that Peter Rowe was actually about 71 years old. This guy is born in 1953, and I wonder how many years he's been playing chess for. So that is kind of interesting. And of course, our wonderful Brian here is not very young himself. He's only 54 years young. So we have a battle of the ages in some sense. We have two senior men as far as chess is concerned, and they're going to show us how they grew up playing chess. Brian responds with d5. We get knight f3 here, knight f6, all of these standard moves, and his opponent decides to go bishop f4, essaying the London system. The London system that is much hated by a lot of people. A lot of young players would hate you if you play the London. But hey, if Ding Liren could play it in the World Championship, why not test out the London, right? I have tried the London myself against my coach some time back, but I never stuck with it. Brian responds with e6 and his opponent goes e3 here. So far, everything is standard moves. Brian goes check. He blocks. We get this move. Okay, and it is actually right here. Up to this position on move 10 here. All of these moves have been seen. A few games have reached this position between a number of 2200s, 2300s in the database, but nothing too serious. No significant tournaments have been played in this opening. So when Peter Rowe actually withdraws or retreats his bishop to g3 here, this is now as at move 11 that we have a completely new game. Brian responds with a6. I'm imagining maybe he wants to go b5 here or something of this nature. And Peter Rowe develops his bishop, another standard move in the London system. Brian develops his knight. Um, Peter Rowe develops his knight and Brian develops his bishop to the d7 square. Peter Rowe jumps with his knight into this square. Computer was saying you need to castle already. It doesn't look like much, but we are going to see how this unfolds. Brian did not respond correctly. Brian brought his queen to this position. I'm not sure what the idea really is for putting this queen in this position. I'm not really sure. And already in this position, I was thinking, wait, he's just going to go here and support his knight. But Peter Rowe did not do that. This is kind of thematic. Usually in these positions, you want to go f4. He does not do that. He put his king rather on e2. Now, this is the first time I am seeing either of these moves in the London, especially on both sides of the board at the same time. Brian goes h6 here, kind of asking Peter Rowe, what is it you want to do? And by the way, computer is already screaming that Peter Rowe has a +1 advantage. He's completely crushing it here. He needs to castle and break the center. Peter Rowe goes h4 instead. Brian goes h5 to stop him from advancing further. Peter Rowe continues to reroute his knights, and Brian gets his knight into this square. Peter Rowe moves his bishop honestly, when I was looking at the game, I was completely unsure what this bishop was supposed to be doing here. Like, what is this bishop doing? Is it preventing g5 maybe? Is it so that if you play g5, I'll just take or take? I'm not sure what this bishop was doing. But anyway, Brian decided to trade, and we get a big trade in the center, and Brian castles queenside. And that is the best move. Of course, all the advantage for white is completely gone. White had a plus 1.2 advantage at some point. At this point, the game is completely equal, completely balanced, and Peter Rowe retreats this bishop again. So if you look at this bishop has made, it has been yo-yoing in this position for a while, and that's not very good. Brian swings his rook over. I imagine maybe he wants to play, I guess, g5. Peter Rowe decides to castle long, and again, he has lost his advantage. Brian took his knight back. Peter Rowe moves his king out of the way, and Brian brings his queen to, I guess, a much better square. Peter Rowe strikes in the center, breaks open the center. You would see that that bishop is hanging, and Brian offers a bishop trade. The players have refused to trade. I don't know why they're not trading their pieces. And finally, they traded off the bishops, and Peter Rowe kicks the knight out of town. The knight retreats, and he goes with the bishop. I don't know why Brian. Well, okay, the knight is actually attacked. I guess he can't really defend it, maybe. Okay. And so Brian plays that move, and Peter Rowe pushes the pawn, and the position is completely closed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, look at this position. This position went from equal a few moves ago. Peter Rowe moves his bishop here. Good move, by the way. The best move in the position. Brian pushed his pawn to basically cut off the knight. I can imagine if he moves the king to defend the knight, then maybe this move is going to come. But then you can actually now play this, and nothing works here. But Brian decides to not do that. He pushed the pawn, and just a single pawn push in this position. Now, when you look at this pawn push opens up an attack on this pawn, the a6 pawn. It also looks like, okay, you're doing something here, but actually this doesn't do much because Brian just counters it with b5, and everything is shut down in this position. For now, the knight is out to launch on the corner of the board, but you can easily move your king and rotate the knight back into the game. So black is currently completely winning. It's about plus 1.5 advantage in this position. But we'll see how the players maneuver this game. Peter Rowe consolidates his pawn chain. Brian kind of does the same thing, and they move their rooks. Brian trades a set of rooks, all the rooks are traded, and we get this position. Now, look at this position. Think of the end game that is about to ensue here. You would notice that, okay, Brian has all his pawns on light squares. Fantastic. All his pawns are on light squares, which means that in the end game, all end games are going to be winning for black. Remember, one of the chess principles you have to learn, or you learn when you start learning chess, is that if your opponent has a bishop of a certain color, say a dark color bishop like this, then you want to put all of your pawns on the light squares. And that is what Brian has successfully done here. So if these queens are ever traded off, like we would see in the game, Brian is going to have a knight. The knight can jump from a dark square to a light square, and from a light square to a dark square, meaning that the knight is going to be a much more useful piece than the bishop. And this is what we are going to see in this game. The players continue to shuffle, and eventually, after a few moves, check, 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 and eventually we are going to have the queens traded off. Brian not only traded off the queens, his opponent allowed him win a pawn before the queens are finally traded. Now we get this position, and Brian is up a pawn. In addition to that, his opponent has a bad bishop, and Brian has a good knight. And let's see how Brian capitalizes on this advantage. He begins to bring his king. He moved his knight. The knight is just going to keep maneuvering. And finally, the last pawn has joined the light square party. You see, all of Brian's pawns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all his pawns are currently on light squares, and all of Peter's pawns here are on dark squares. In addition to that, look at where the black king is. This king can easily walk up the board to this part and start gobbling up all of white's pawns here. And how did Brian manage this position? We start with some maneuvering here. The players continue to shuffle and shuffle and shuffle, and it was Brian that made the first pawn push here. Now, the computer does not completely approve of this move, but I think it makes sense. I think it's a move that makes sense. It does not damage black's position. All your pawns are still on light squares. There is no infiltration for this king whatsoever. And the black king stands sure-footed in the center of the board, making sure that everything is fine in his camp. The knight is the main character here. The knight continues to maneuver, and Brian goes for yet another pawn break. The players trade a set of pawns. Now, it's important to note that if you take this, you just lose the game, right? The king is right there on time to win this pawn, and this H pawn is going to become a queen. So, Peter Rowe does not take the knight, he moves his king in this direction. But at the same time, notice that Brian can also not move his king because he's just going to take the knight, right? So Brian goes here with check. Peter Rowe tries to run his king this way. Now, if you get careless and grab a pawn here, the white king actually arrives first. Well, you can kind of make it a competition. He's going to gobble, you gobble. He's going to gobble, and then you have to, I think here you actually have to kind of bring your king a little more to this side of the board. And this is going to be a race. It becomes kind of tricky winning this position. So, of course, Brian does not do that. He went check, and then he retreated his king already. Computer says you can actually grab a3. I would grab a3 here, but Brian is just being very cautious. He does not want to make any mistakes. The king goes back, attacks the bishop. See the funny thing here. The bishop could not retreat to b2 because the knight covers that square. It's very reminiscent of the type of thing Brian would do when we would play certain games over the board. He would have some positions against me where he's going to be attacking a piece of mine or a pawn of mine, and I don't have a way to protect the pawn, or I don't have a meaningful way of protecting the pawn. And that is what you see here, right? His opponent cannot retreat the bishop to defend this pawn, and Brian gobbles yet another pawn. And now he's up 2 pawns in this position. They are currently on move 72, and Brian is already up 2 pawns. He has more than enough time on the clock. The clocks are not here, but Brian has over 30 minutes on the clock, and his opponent has only 9 minutes. So we are going to have a long maneuvering game for sure. Brian continues to maneuver the knight, and there is one move I love so much, and it is the move knight e5. Knight e5, great move, the final move of the game. In this position, Peter Rowe resigned the game because there is nothing you can play here. Every move loses. So, for example, where do you want to go? If you take your bishop to e1, if you go bishop e1, then there is knight f3 check, forking the king and the bishop, winning the bishop. If you go bishop, g1, there is the same thing. There is knight f3, forking the king and the bishop, winning the bishop. So you can't do that. If you go, where else do you want to go with the bishop? You want to go here with the bishop. Then the knight drops back. You have knight d3 here. The bishop cannot return to the e1 square to defend the b pawn because the knight covers that square. So you're going to lose the b pawn and you're going to lose the game. What do you play? There's no move. White is in zugzwang. White is basically in zugzwang. If you go here, say, okay, if he plays this, then I'm going to drop my bishop here. The thing is, he doesn't have to play that. He goes check here. And check here means the king cannot go here, the king cannot go here, the king has to go this way. You lose, you're going to lose the h4 pawn. And if you lose the h4 pawn, you lose the game. So this single move, knight e5, is a fantastic move from Brian. And with this move on the board, his opponent resigned the game, and Brian clenches his very first win for the SVG team. Big congratulations to Brian. We are going to jump right into round 5 and see yet another fantastic victory from Brian. This second game is between Brian Cottle, the SVG player, my teammate that has won a bunch of games so far. And Mahendra Gurung from Bhutan, you can see Brian has the white pieces, and if Brian has the white pieces, Brian is going to play the English. And of course, Brian goes c4, the English is on the board. We have all the regular moves of the English, regular developing moves, trade, regular moves. Up to this point, we have a lot of games in the database. Brian's opponent decides to go bishop c4 and Brian castles. This is move 11, and we have a bunch of games. 2 games at least in the database that reached this exact position. Now, the correct way to play here is going to be to take the knight. You have to take the knight, damage the pawn structure. That's the whole point, I think. But his opponent did not do it. He developed his bishop to this square, and white has the advantage already. Brian did not seize it though. The computer is saying that you should retreat the knight to e2. Basically say you're no longer going to damage my structure. I'm going to kick out the bishop. I'll probably put my knight in the center and we'll play from there. But Brian decides to go knight d4. Not a bad move. The position is equal. And again, his opponent does not damage the structure. His opponent does not trade. Now you can actually trade. Give black a weakness on the c6 square and try to pile up against that weakness. But Brian did not do that either. And once again, the game is balanced. His opponent refuses to take the knight. And now we have a completely equal position. No, nothing crazy has happened just yet. Now, in this position, Brian's opponent actually blunders something very interesting. An interesting move order. I did not see it myself when I was looking at the game. When I was watching the game, I did not even think of this move. But now that I look at it again in hindsight, look at this. You trade on this square. You give them an isolated pawn here. You jump with the knight in here. Put pressure on that pawn. How do you defend? You can defend with the rook. But now you trade the knights here. When they take, you put pressure on this other pawn. How are you defending that pawn? There's no good move here. There's literally no good move. Computer says to go queen g5 here. But then you take queen takes e4. And white is already up a pawn. This is a plus 1.8 advantage here. White is completely winning here. But Brian did not go for that line. I don't know if he saw it in the game. Or maybe not. He decided to move his rook to the c file. Not a bad move. The game is still balanced. And his opponent blunders the same move sequence disaster once again. I don't even know what to call it at this point. Once again, knight takes d4. Knight f4 hitting the pawn, defend, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c2, and you win a pawn. There's no way to defend that pawn. But again, it was missed in the position. This is almost +2 advantage for white. Brian misses it. He goes a3 here. Not a bad move. The position is still balanced. So far, white is not worse at all. The position is just always been in the balance. And once again, Brian's opponent blunders the same thing. Knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c2. Oh, it doesn't work like this, sorry. This time is different. Okay, knight takes, pawn takes, knight here, puts pressure on that pawn. But in the immediate, you can't really play. Computer says you should actually take this one first. And you can't recapture now because the queen is going to be hanging. So look at this is crazy. Look at this. This is actually very crazy here. What is going on? Enable dictation. Cancel. Not now. Okay, good. This is ridiculous that his opponent blundered this twice. So knight takes. You actually have to take with the queen. You have to take with the queen here. And if you take with the queen, there's knight f4, forking the queen and the pawn. And how do you defend that pawn? Do you see that? Computer is giving a very complex line where you play knight takes f2, and then you have to play rook takes, queen takes e3. You have to play rook c2 to defend the rook, and all of this. This is computer trash here. The point is white is better. White is going to win a pawn in this line. But Brian misses that. Did Brian actually find it this time around? I think he did. Okay, knight takes e6, queen takes, knight here, queen here, and Brian grabs the pawn, and they trade. And when you look at this position, Brian is simply up a pawn. He's just up a clean pawn and completely winning. This is almost +3. His opponent comes here, Brian moves his rook. He grabs a pawn, but there is a tactic. There is a tactic. Brian grabs and goes check, wins the rook there, and his rook jumps in immediately. So this is where it looks like material is equal, but black is actually losing material here. Rook d7, you move the bishop, you lose a pawn over there, and then you lose another pawn. If you take the bishop, I take your bishop. So just like that, going into this endgame, Brian is suddenly 2 pawns up and completely winning. His opponent goes here, Brian offers the rook trade, and his opponent traded the rooks. I was like, what nonsense? How do you trade the rooks in that position? But he didn't have, I guess he had a choice though. He didn't have to trade the rooks. And then we go into the classic endgame. We are going to have an endgame with bishops of the same color. And Brian was I like the way he played this. He was too smart about this. Look at this. Immediately he found his opportunity. Look at this. Immediately he found the opportunity, he traded off the knights. He traded off the knights, and we go into this same color ending, but one player has a gazillion pawns. Brian is up 3 pawns in this position, literally 3 pawns. His opponent kept playing for some reason. I don't know why he kept playing, but he kept playing until they got to this position on move 55. Is this 55 or 59? Yeah, I think it was move 55. On move 55, Brian goes a7 here and asks his opponent, what are you doing with your bishop? If you take the pawn, then I'll just take your bishop and one of these pawns is going to become a queen. If you don't take the pawn, then I'll make a queen. And in this position, Mahendran resigned the game, and this is the second big win for Brian Cottle of SVG in this event. You guys, Brian has played fantastic chess. He has made draws against FIDE masters. He has held a draw against I think a 2200 or something of that nature. So he's actually been playing incredible chess so far. And guess what? The SVG women team also won a game. Our board one, our team leader our captain on board one, and then Chukwu Chinedu won his game yesterday, won his game today, and I'm sure they are going to get even more wins as we get deeper and deeper into this event. So a big congratulations to the SVG team. Thanks to Brian for a fantastic lesson on these end games that I have just watched. And with that, I'll say goodbye to you guys. Now, if you find any interesting games on the candidates, did I say candidates? If you find any interesting games in the Olympiad, please let me know. I would like to see them. Interesting end games. I wanted to cover games from people like Ding Liren, Magnus Carlsen. They all made some wild draws today against 2500s. And I was like, what the heck? But hey, that's how chess is sometimes. I'm happy that SVG did not make draws. They beat their opponent and we got good wins this time around. All right, that is it for today. I will see you guys in the next video. If you're new here, subscribe. Bye.